It's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about a wellness company whose products I've been using for many years, which I'll also have in my tiny house, and you might like to as well. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while and following along, or you know me personally, you'll know that health is super important to me. It's my number one value, and that includes a healthy home environment, especially a healthy tiny home environment. And Block Blue Light are an amazing company who supply specialty downlights, light bulbs, reading lamps, blue blocking glasses, and much more to help reduce your exposure to artificial light from all your devices, regular LED lights, and other unnatural sources of lighting, as well as electromagnetic fields or EMFs, especially at the wrong times of the day or night. Artificial light can impact our sleep and can contribute to other health effects, often unknowingly, which we'll cover in a future episode. And just like anything, the key is what impact this has on our health over the long term. Block Blue Light's products use amber and red lights or lenses, think sunset, candle, moonlight, and fire vibes, which humans naturally would have been exposed to, especially in the evenings in our ancestral past. I especially love my clear crystal blue blocking glasses to wear during the day to work on my computer, as well as their light bulbs and twilight sleep lamps at night, and their twilight red light torches for camping weekends away. And in my tiny home, instead of having regular LED downlights, all my downlights are amber ones from Block Blue Light, which means I don't have to worry about exposure to unnatural blue light. And for someone who has had challenges with sleep for several years, I absolutely notice a difference in sleep when I use my specialty blue blockers, lamps, and lights, which have been shown to support production of your sleep hormone melatonin for healthier sleep patterns. Now, the good news is Block Blue Light are offering you, a listener of the podcast, 10% off your order when you use my unique link and code. Just head over to tinyhouseconversations.com/blue light and use the code THC podcast, that's THC for Tiny House Conversations, to get your discount. I'll also put a link in the show notes for you for easy access. And if you haven't heard my Tiny House conversation with naturopath Amy Skilton all about reducing EMFs in your tiny home or any home, this includes reducing your exposure to blue light. So check out episode number 32, and I'll put a link in the show notes to that as well. And stay tuned for a podcast all about reducing artificial blue light in your tiny home and why it's important for your health. Now, here's the intro for today's show. Welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. On the show today, I have Everett Norris, who is a certified passive house tradesperson, a qualified licensed builder, and director of Ever Homes Limited. During his apprentice years, Everett built his first tiny house on the weekends and eventually led tiny house workshops annually. Everett met his wife at a natural building conference where they bonded over their love of natural building. They started running tiny house workshops together, teaching designing and building of tiny houses starting in 2018. They are about to start building a compact strawbale passive house in Christchurch, New Zealand. And in this conversation, we talked about energy efficiency, passive house, and passive solar design, some considerations for heating and cooling a tiny home, the importance of air quality in a tiny home. We also talked about Everett's tiny house building workshops. And then towards the end of the conversation, Everett brought up this concept of hedonic adaptation, which relates to human happiness. And we talked about finding intrinsic happiness and knowing your why for wanting to build or live in a tiny house, and so much more. I found Everett to be a really interesting and lovely guy to speak with, and we discussed some things that we haven't talked about on the show before. So with that being said, on to this tiny house conversation with Everett. Hey, Everett, welcome to Tiny House Conversations, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Lucy.
Yeah, so Everett, I'd love to hear a bit about your background. So are you able to let us know, how did you get into building tiny houses? I know that you also lived in a tiny house for a time. So yeah, anything that you can share with us about all of that. And I know that you're into natural building as well.
Yeah, sure. So I got interested in building as a teenager, got quite a bit of experience building strawbale houses, which I fell in love with. When I started my apprenticeship, I wanted to build my own house. And the fastest way to do that was to do a tiny house. Basically, I was, first year of apprenticeship, I was learning to build and then building my own. And then from then onwards, I've been sort of in the tiny house community, involved in the workshops, and then starting to run them. So it was, I guess just a general transition, but it always super nerdy about buildings and building science and throughout it all. And that's actually how my wife and I met, was at a natural building conference.
That's really nice to kind of bond over something like that.
Yeah, bond over building physics. That's the way to meet people, right?
Can nerd out over things that you both enjoy and appreciate. Yeah. Oh, I love it. And I think I understand she's an architect, right?
Yes. Yeah, or architectural designer. She hasn't. You need to do so many 5 years before you can call yourself an architect.
Right.
So
Okay.
She hasn't done the time yet.
Yeah.
Architectural designer.
Okay, that's a pretty cool combination though. So like the building and then the architecture and the design and then the natural side of things. That's really, really cool. I'd love if you're able to just let us know a bit more about, your tiny house experience. So you built that tiny house yourself. What size was your tiny home that you're living in?
My first one was 8 meters by 2.4 with a loft.
Okay, so it's like a little bit on the larger side for some tiny homes. Yeah,
it was a second-hand tiny house trailer, so that sort of dictated my size. That was my first one. Yeah.
Okay, and then what about? So how many have you lived in overall?
Lived in 3, owned 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you
probably a dozen.
Oh, really? Yeah. That's amazing. We'll definitely get into that because I know you do like the tiny house workshops and stuff to help people build their own tiny houses. Did you feel like from like maybe your first tiny house to then, the other ones that you've lived in, that you're able to kind of, you built something and then you lived in it and you're able to sort of see like what worked for you and what didn't and maybe what you wanted to do in the next tiny homes? Did you kind of go about it and building in different features that you're like, okay, I actually feel like we need this or could have done this differently?
I would actually say my first tiny house was amazing. So I didn't have a big criticisms for it. I guess it just a different stage of life. Are you familiar with the time, cost, quality triangle?
I'm actually not, but I'm curious to hear more about it.
So if you could imagine a triangle, on one corner you've got cost, on another corner you've got quality, and another corner you have time, right? So when I was building my first tiny house, I was just an apprentice builder. I had more time and less money. And so if you think about where you are in that triangle, I'm getting very high quality, very cheap, but I paid for it in time. And so it was actually very time consuming. Everything in the house was recycled. And so you end up with a very unique, beautiful, one of a kind build. And so it actually was a stunning house. The second time around, I was a bit more even. So, at good quality, like more in the center of the triangle. I built the second one a lot faster than I built the first one. But then you make costs in money. So the first one, for instance, in New Zealand dollars, I know everything's different in Australia. New Zealand dollars, it cost me 40,000, and then the second one cost me 60. And so you can sort of see, investing more and increase the cost, but then save on time. Because by the time the second time around, my time was more valuable, basically. Yeah, and I guess I built a lot smaller.
I feel like what you're talking about with that that triangle, that we can kind of apply that to everything, that a lot of different things that we do in life, right? Like not just when it comes to the tiny house building, but also just like assessing that what was it? It was time, quality, and cost. Yeah, like we can kind of use that framework for so many things. So I really love that analogy. And so were you were on or off the grid?
No, we're always grid tied.
What was that experience like living tiny? Because I know that you're transitioning into now building a strawbale home, which is a bit larger than a tiny home. So do you feel like, you had a good experience living in a smaller space, and now it's kind of like a different stage of life for you to sort of move to something a bit bigger and a bit different?
I absolutely loved living in the tiny house. I loved how we could just say what temperature it was going to be whenever, and it would only cost, dollars to maintain. There's huge benefits. I have absolutely no criticism. The only reason we're moving now to a bigger house is that my wife and I are going to have kids. Basically, she did not want to do it in a tiny house. So
totally understandable. Understandable, yeah. People do make it work in smaller spaces, but I guess it depends. No. It's different for everyone, right? Yeah.
Absolute full power to do them. Yeah. I think it's awesome when people do that.
But it's not, but of course it's not for everyone. Like it can, it'll work for some people, just like anything, it'll work for some people and for others it won't. So I'd love to know a bit about your strawbale home, then you're building, just like some of the features. Are you taking any inspiration that you had from the tiny houses that you built and that you've lived in previously to then sort of, include different things in your strawbale home that you're building?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's compact, right? So just minimal wasted space. Not as much as you'd think. So for a math reason, to make tiny houses work, the best way to make it work is to customize it for yourself, exactly to your needs. Part of the way you do that is making custom cabinetry to the space to make it work really well. So with more effort, you can make a smaller place feel a lot bigger. If you've got the land, it's actually the same price to have less thought out, less unique cabinetry and a bigger space. You could go as far as a tiny house and you could make a bigger house feel amazing, but it also means you're putting a lot more effort towards custom cabinetry. So it's a way up. You have to choose, between how much do you want it designed for you, or how generic you want it.
Makes sense. And I know that you're, particularly passionate about natural building and, passive house design. We've talked a little bit about, because I have a interest in a general sense, like natural living is something that I'm really passionate about. And I've done a few podcast episodes with experts in like building biology, including like mold prevention, chemicals in building materials, reducing electromagnetic fields, that kind of thing. And by the way, for anyone that's listening, if you haven't checked out any of those episodes, I'll put a link in the show notes. But you talk about this passive house design and energy efficiency. And, we haven't really talked about that kind of stuff on the podcast before. So I'd love to hear a bit more from your experience and your perspective. Can you let us know a bit more about what passive house design is and the principles behind that, especially if anyone hasn't heard of what that is before and, just wanting to get a bit of an overview and understanding of that?
Just to clarify, there's two different things. There's passive house and there's passive solar. Passive solar is design principles, basically facing towards the equator, trying to, more thermal mass. And then passive house is a German standard about how to make extremely energy efficient houses. A lot of my work has been building super energy efficient houses, a lot of strawbale houses, but other houses as well. So on that note, when you get a house and you want it to be super energy efficient, problems occur. And so other countries, so we're in New Zealand and Australia right now, right?
Yeah.
The other countries have done that before us. And so we can sort of see the problems that happen and everything you have to think about to mitigate these problems. So you asked the question, passive house. Passive house is just a standard which says you don't use more than 15 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. What does that mean? It just means you use very little power, incredibly low. In New Zealand, it's about 10% of your typical build amount of power to maintain. It's close to not needing a heater. In Australia, some of the passive houses I've seen just use a like big houses, just use a towel heater to heat the house. But then problems occur when you start doing that, because easiest way to do that is to make the house airtight and insulated a lot. But in the moment you start doing that, you start hitting moisture problems. And so you can sort of see it's like you can't just do one thing in isolations. The moment you start trying to improve the efficiency of your house, you also need to improve your weather tightness. You need to improve everything, like how well it works with moisture, how well it works with air, everything, air quality inside the building. You have to solve all of them simultaneously. Otherwise, you end up with a mold, basically. Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think there's a lot of big ones to bring towards tiny houses. Takeaways you can get from some of the most efficient houses in the world, and the design problems that they have solved.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it just kind of makes me think of, so it's like if you think of the home as like a whole system that it's working together, it's like you're saying if you make it super airtight and super insulated, then you're not going to have enough ventilation and you can create these other issues. Whereas you have to kind of look at all the moving parts and how they work together. It's making me think of like maybe the analogy of the human body and how you can't just look at like the brain or one organ system or another, like the nervous system or the hormones. You've got to look at them all together because they're all working together and they're all affecting each other. And if one thing's out of balance, then it's going to throw something else off. So that really makes sense. And what about in terms of, so you're talking about energy efficiency and talking about heating and cooling. So can you talk a little bit more about just the different aspects of heating and cooling when you're trying to be energy efficient in a tiny home, when you're I guess constructing it, but also maybe are there things that you can do when you're also already living in it too?
Yeah, absolutely. When people are building super energy efficient houses, so in this case, we're talking, say, like a passive house, the way they do it is they model the whole house and run it through like models that work out the heat gain, the heat loss, for your geographic position, and then make a whole like workout and then design around it. So where I bring this to take away for tiny houses is that probably the most common problem that done in tiny houses is we tend to put in probably a little bit too many windows and not enough shading. So it's very easy to heat a tiny house. The volume is very small, but it overheats quite fast when you get sun coming in. So you can work it out, right? So 1 square meter of sun is basically 1 kilowatt. And so you think of every meter of sun coming through your glass as 1 kilowatt heater. So it adds up. So even small amounts of eaves or shade sails or having less windows makes a big difference in tiny houses. So that's probably the most common. Like I think when people design their first tiny houses, like in our workshops and so forth, they tend to have like 1 too many windows, sometimes 2. There's wonderful online calculators. You can work out the lux, the amount of lumens in the house, the heating,
the light, yeah,
and find a comfortable point. But it's very easy. It's much easier to heat your house than it is to cool your house. And so it's sort of easier to shy on one side than the other. In this case, I'm talking about Australia and New Zealand. It's different.
Yeah.
It depends on where you are.
Yeah, for sure. And what about, so you mentioned air quality before too. I think that's something really interesting to think about, because I guess you can talk about it in terms of, well, what kind of building materials are you using, and are there chemicals in your home and all of that. What other aspects are you thinking about air quality from when you're constructing a tiny home, as well as if someone's living in their tiny home?
Main problem is moisture. Second is carbon dioxide, and third would be VOCs. And so when you've got moisture, well, adequate ventilation. That advice to give to people, and it's much more common in Europe, is you, in the morning when it's cold, you open up your doors and windows and let the air dump all of your air and replace all of the air in the house. And then you do the same in the evening. And there's reasons behind that. When you think about overnight, your carbon dioxide and moisture in your air increases. And so typically in the morning, the air quality of the house is quite poor. So I have like sensors, I can prove it. And even people cracking windows is not enough typically, unless it's windy and you've got cross ventilation. It's actually not quite enough. The air quality is quite bad, as well as the moisture content. If you actually think of, heat as energy, air has quite a low amount of heat in it. So your surfaces hold a lot more energy than the air does. So when you dump all of your air in your house, it makes the air colder, but all of your surfaces are still warm. It can actually heat up quite quickly because you haven't lost all of your energy. You've only lost a portion, a small portion. That's the sort of, advice they give to people. But now you're asking me, like, what would I do? I've become quite strong now on just putting in heat recovery ventilation. Heat recovery is where you have a fan. It's got a heat exchanger. It pulls air in and pushes air out. And it runs past the heat exchanger. It transfers the heat into the air that's coming in. And you can get little units, 1,500 New Zealand. I don't know what it would be in Australia. That you just put in a wall. And they have moisture sensors in them. And so they speed up and slow down based on what's going on in the house. And then it means that all the air that's coming in is warm. So the typical efficiency is, for these very small units, is 80%. If they're a bit bigger, you can get up to 90%. So you work on that. Let's say it's 90%. If you're 20 degrees inside and 0 degrees outside, it means the air that's coming in is 18 degrees. And so in what we know in New Zealand is that the brands did a bunch of research showing that people don't open their windows enough. And in tiny houses, it's actually more of a problem because we have more moisture in the absolute volume sense. So we still have one bathroom, we still have one kitchen, but as a volume, it's a lot smaller. What I talked about, the opening up morning and evening, regardless of the weather, I would pretty much encourage everyone in tiny houses to do that. And but if you're just building one, the easy way is just put in a ventilation unit, and then you don't have to think about it again. The other benefit then is you get a large amount of efficiency from that, right? You're recovering the heat. So particularly in winter, you're not having to heat the air that's coming in.
Yeah, yeah. And what about like things like HEPA air filters and that kind of thing? What do you think about those?
The thing is, if you can ventilate, if you can mechanically ventilate, that should do the job. And so you can just have a filter on the inlet of air. Mm-hmm. And so let's say it's smoking outside because forest fires, it can filter the air that's coming in to the building. And so that's a lot more common, particularly in Europe or Asia, where the air quality outside can be worse than inside. And so you can just filter the air as it's coming in. And I know what you're saying. You're talking about just standalone units inside the building.
Yeah, because there might be people that they're already living in their tiny house and they kind of haven't really gone through the construction process of putting the systems into place like what you're talking about. So if someone's maybe listening and thinking, well, how can I improve the air quality in my tiny home? So you mentioned before like VOCs, moisture and that kind of thing.
So you've got moisture, carbon dioxide, and VOCs. As far as I'm aware, the HEPA air filters don't help with the moisture or the carbon dioxide. So really you want to, I might need to fact check myself on that actually. But
we can look up that, like we can look it up later.
Yeah. If you can just ventilate more, that solves the problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with the VOC side, you can just, minimize the VOCs you put into the building, formaldehydes and so forth.
Yeah. And if anyone that's listening isn't familiar with the term VOC, so it's volatile organic compounds, and you can find that in different building materials, in different paints and other conventional finishes that go into a home or a tiny home. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to clarify because, some people might have heard it before. And if anyone hasn't listened to episode number 40, I did an episode with building biology new build consultant Zara Dakota, and we talked about building materials and VOCs and all that kind of stuff. So, I'll put a link in the show notes for that. And I love the passion that you have around all this technical side when it comes to building science and just construction of a tiny home. I know that you teach people how to build their own tiny homes through your workshops that you run with your wife. Are you able to let us know a bit more about those? Because I've seen them on your website and they look quite comprehensive. There's a lot of different things that you take people through. So yeah, just let us know what they involve and who they're for.
Yeah. Oh, so we build a tiny house. We have a week, about 8 days, and we've got about 2 days of theory mashed in there somewhere, and then we basically teach all the different tools that you're likely to need when building your own house, and then work through all the different systems. We don't tend to finish tiny house, but we at least have a go at every system. So we'll build all the walls, show some windows, show some cladding, put the roof in, put some internal lining possibly. And it's just a great way for people to learn, have a go if they're afraid to get started doing it themselves.
Yeah. And so they get to actually physically get hands-on experience and see how you do it and then get a go at doing it, go at being on the tools and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's all about getting on the tools and doing it yourself. The goal is that everyone leaves away confident enough to start building their own house. So.
Yeah. And also they get to do tiny house design as well. Yeah. Like kind of do a rough.
Yeah. So my wife runs them through design, basically, design tools that they can have and things they need to think about when designing their own house.
I think you might have had Ryan and Ziski at your workshops because they've been on the podcast before. And for anyone that hasn't listened, they were on episode number 4. And I think they actually mentioned you on that podcast. And then I know you also know Marie Berenger who was on the podcast too. So I'll put a link in the show notes for those episodes too. But I see that you even talk to people about, a lot of the different aspects because there's plumbing, there's power, there's off-grid stuff, there's composting toilets. We talked about the hands-on, like getting on the tools and the framing and cladding and stuff. The people that you've taught in your tiny house workshops, are they mostly people that are going to DIY, build their tiny homes, or do you get some people that are kind of there because they just, I don't know, they want to learn more and get that experience? Or do you also have professional builders coming to your tiny house workshops? Maybe they haven't built tiny houses before, but they're wanting to go down that path as well. Like, is it for different demographics of people?
Probably the vast majority want to build their own tiny house. So they're coming because of that. And then others do it because it's basically a introduction to building in 8 days. About 20% is tiny house specific and the rest is building. So a few people come because they want to learn to build, full stop. But I'd say most people, it's because they want to build their own tiny house.
Yeah, and you don't have to have any experience, do you? You can kind of literally be someone that's just never picked up any kind of tool before, and then you sort of start from the beginning.
That's the point.
That's awesome. No, that's great because it can be quite daunting. And I know that for someone like myself, for example, the idea of building my own tiny homes, like I would love to do something like that, but I literally have no transferable skills in anything. So for me, it sounds like quite daunting. Well, I mean, in terms of like some people might have done like, I don't know, graphic design, or they might have, maybe growing up they might have built something with their family or something, maybe had a hand in building a shelf. I've never done anything like that before at all. So that's why I think what you're doing is really cool, because you can literally have no experience at all, not know where to start, and then have a go at on the tools and be like, okay, I can do this. Because I know, like, speaking to Marie, she's now really inspired to want to put a drill in, like, I think talking about women specifically, like putting a drill in every woman's hand. And I think there's just something really powerful about that, because for a lot of us, it's not something that we grew up doing or thinking that we actually have the ability to do that. So I love that you're teaching people from scratch. And are you only doing that in New Zealand, or do you ever come over to Australia?
I've only done it in New Zealand. I only do one a year.
Yeah.
So it's an awful lot of fun. It does take a lot.
Yeah.
An awful lot.
I can imagine. And then you also have different experts that come and contribute as well, right? Talking about different topics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really
Yes.
nice. It's like I guess a collaboration or co-creating with different people, and that's really nice.
Yeah. You were just talking about Marie. Like, she's
Yeah.
amazing. She's been a builder at quite a few of the tiny house workshops, and I love how good a role model she is. So,
Yeah.
because she came from no experience building her tiny house, she's an apprentice builder now. So she's building full time. But when she started, she didn't know anything, and so she's a great like example to other people, and I think
Yeah.
she's awesome, like very good at teaching. So I think she's doing great.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. Yeah, it really just, I know when I spoke to her, it made me just go, wow, like, because you can often have limiting beliefs, like, can I actually do something like this? And it's like, no, you actually can. You got to start somewhere and, take one step at a time and go to things like what you're offering. And
There's only one skill that really matters. And I think there's probably the pivotal skill is the ability to break down big things into small chunks. So what I say is that it's quite intimidating for people when you say build a wall or build a house. They're like no one can just, when you say build a house, you can't just do that.
Yeah.
You have to be like, okay, what is the house made of? Doing this, and then what happens first? And so you work all the way back of like, okay, I want to do the foundation. So it means I am going to the store and I'm getting boxing to surround the foundation. And like, you have to break it down into small enough chunks that you can actually do the thing.
Yeah.
And probably the most useful skill, because otherwise you get too intimidated by the project. But if you can break it down, and you can not know how to do a thing, but you can just be that the next thing is find out how to screw in thing,
Yeah.
and then do that, and then you screw the thing in. You can work your way. I've been amazed at people, like some people, no experience, and then just be able to run away with it.
That's a really great point. I'm glad that you said that, because I also feel like that can just apply again to anything that we do. Like if it's a big project that we have, whether it's building a tiny house or it could be something to do with our work or just anything that we're doing in our life, it's like that analogy of how do you eat an elephant? You don't try and do it all at once. You got to break it down into the small parts so it's not so overwhelming. And then you just take, I often say, I've said I think a few times on the podcast when I talk about my own journey of just, you take one tiny, we can say, I would normally have said small, but since we're talking about tiny houses, it's like you take one tiny step at a time. And then once you do that, you go into the next thing and the next thing. And all of a sudden, at some point, tiny things turn into this really big thing. And you can look back at it and just be like, wow, look what I've created. I didn't think I could do that. But it's like what you say, you just got to, it's all the little layers, you know, that you eventually get through.
Yeah. And it's all like maintaining momentum. If you can do one thing a day, even if it's a small thing, then you sort of will progress. So I remember, when I built my first tiny house, I was working full time. And so I just had, I had to do 3 things a day. The things could be tiny, but it just, times it over a year and a half, and like a lot can happen. So it's just, breaking down the things into small things and then just working your way through it.
Yeah, definitely. And do you find from having all these different people come through your workshops now, are there any misconceptions that you hear often or that you've heard before about building a tiny house?
So you can build it really cheap, but you probably shouldn't. Especially, when people have watched videos from the States and they have done things for, unreasonably cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in New Zealand, you're going to spend that just on the trailer,
Or more than that on the trailer, maybe.
Yeah. Or more than that on the trailer. Again, that time cost quality, you have to sacrifice somewhere. So if you're going to build it really cheap, you're either going to take a very long time or your quality is going to be very low. And so it's okay. Like if you go in it fully understanding what you're doing, it's fine to make those compromises. But the more extreme you are in any of your corners, the more it costs you, like in efficiency. You're better to be more in the middle than you are to be completely one end or another. So probably the biggest misconception is, yes, you could build it really cheaply, but you have to sacrifice in some other areas. And I don't think you should make those sacrifices. I talked about we gave that time as one example. But so quality is another example. One thing, for instance, is people want to just do secondhand windows and just use single glazed glass in aluminium. And our rationale is it's so cheap to heat, I don't need to worry about energy efficiency for the house. And half of that is true. It is cheap to heat the house, but there's more going on than just that. So if you've got, particularly like non-thermally broken aluminium, when you've got moist air, so particularly if you don't have a heat recovery, but even then, heat recovery was ventilation, mechanical ventilation. If you've got cold surfaces, it condensates on them. And so you know that from your own experience, condensating on the windows. You can be like, oh, I can save money here. Yes, but now you're more likely to get condensation in other areas, and particularly on aluminium, because aluminium is so thermally poor, or well, depending on what you're trying to do. It's difficult because you want to have it for a while. So I don't know. It's just balance. And if you're not going to be balanced, you just have to go in eyes open, fully understanding what you're doing.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. That's a good misconception to share, because I mean, I guess it depends on what people are wanting to do and what their budget is and that kind of thing. But so essentially you're saying that you can do it on the cheap, but you might, just like we were talking about before, how all the systems work together in a home and you can't really isolate one because it'll affect the other thing. It might come back to bite you a bit later, because if you would have just maybe invested a little bit more in the beginning, you might get something that's longer lasting, better quality, whatever it might be. And you were talking just there about the windows and the thermally broken windows. So from your perspective, is that in terms of like moisture and mold? Because I often hear, I think what's quite common is people using double glaze, but then the thermally broken can be quite good for that purpose as well, right? Like mold and moisture.
Yeah, it's more, in the case of tiny houses, it's more from the mold point.
Yeah.
So there's a catchphrase, cold spots equal mold spots. If a surface is like a lot lower temperature, as the air cools around it, if it goes below its dew point, because the lower the air temperature, the less moisture it can hold in the air. And so if you're 50% humidity at 20 degrees, by the time you get to like 14 degrees, it's like your risk of mold territory there. Like when you get to 80% humidity, that's when you start risking mold. So from a health perspective, you don't want mold. From a longevity perspective, you don't want mold. And so this comes all back to the ventilate your house properly. And you actually need a reasonable amount of insulation, even if you're not. There's other things that can go into it. So what can be a better system? I know it's quite popular just to do like SIPS panels, just like polystyrene sandwiched between either sheets of metal or sheets of ply or board. Another system, the way to think about how to deal with moisture, is allowing the house to breathe. So if your house is vapor permeable, when I say this, I don't mean liquid water. I mean, small amounts of vapor. If it can escape the building in Australia and New Zealand, then it's less likely to have these problems. As you're designing your house, you're trying to like not have anything particularly cold and not have too much moisture.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ways to achieve that, but it's something to think about. And that's where I come back to the easiest thing. When they come to me, wanting to do their tiny house, there's a bunch of ways we can mitigate it, but the easiest way is just sticking in a fan. But like bathroom extraction, kitchen extraction, all these things help to deal with it. I know I keep on coming back to the same things again and again, but it's just because it's like important.
Yeah. And in terms of like your tiny house workshop, so if people are interested in finding out more, they may be over in New Zealand, where is the best place that they can find out more, or if they want to get in contact with you about those?
www.everhomes, everhomes.co.nz.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. So if I don't have one up, you can just sign to the newsletter and I'll email you. So it's one a year, usually early in the year. Next year is a little bit different because I'll be busy on our house. So it's probably going to be organized by a friend of mine up in Auckland. And so it will still go up on the website, but it might not be until later in the year.
Okay, amazing. Well, I'll put a link in the show notes for that. And I mean, is there anything that you wanted to, as we start to close out the conversation today, Everett, is there anything that you wanted to share a bit more that we haven't covered, maybe around your tiny house workshops or anything like that?
This is a side tangent, but I think it's the first thing that we should be talking about at all, in everything. Like, why? Do you know about hedonic adaptation? Do you know what I mean when I say that?
I know a little bit about it, but feel free to go more into it, because I think it's about like human behavior and psychology and stuff, right?
Yeah, right. So there's an absolute wealth of research towards happiness in humans. It's really fascinating. There's a lot of good books out there. I quite like How to Be Miserable. That's a good book. But there's a common trend. You see it in a lot of books on happiness is almost humans aren't designed to be happy. We get used to things. So it's almost from like an evolutionary perspective. If you just become content, then there's no more striving. And so whatever happens, you get used to it. So they give an example. If you get a new TV, you really enjoy that TV for a while, but then you get used to it. And the fascinating thing is when I've got researchers trying to follow people and trying to see what actually makes a difference to happiness, a lot of things don't seem to make any difference towards the numbers that they get, which is quite surprising. You'd think, you get a bigger TV, you'd be happier. You get the new Tesla that you really wanted and you'd be happier. But what happens is you get used to it, and you get used to it way faster than people anticipate. People are surprisingly bad at predicting what will make them happy. They're bad at saying what was made them happy in the past. So what you can sort of see is that there's a trend of the things that do make people happy. It's people, it's connection, it's meaning, it's feeling loved, being surrounded by people you love, it's doing things you like. But a lot of it's the hierarchy thing again, right? It's feeling like you've got a purpose and doing it. All those really matter. When someone wants to build a tiny house, the first question you should be asking is why? What is the things you're trying to accomplish with it? Because it's quite surprising what doesn't make an effect. The list is massive about things that have much less effect than you think they do. Some of the best thing you can do is just having the gratitude journal and eating healthy and exercising. When it comes to the tiny house, you should almost be framing it in a different way. It's what makes you happy, come up with your list, and then figure out what's the best way to achieve those things. And I think most people go the other way around, where they get a big mortgage because they want, for instance, a big house for status reasons. But that's not a really effective way to happiness. And if what you want is the human connection, there's better ways. The reason I end up in a tiny house is that I had a lot of things I wanted in my life, outside the tiny house, or like because of the tiny house. Because the tiny house, it wasn't actually the tiny house that made me happy. It was the life that made me happy. And it was the tiny house gave me more life because I wasn't spending all that money on a big mortgage or big rent. I could prioritize the things that actually do make you happy. It's just understanding that we get used to stuff, and stuff is quite an inefficient way towards happiness. And you should really prioritize the things that do make you happy.
I love that you said all of that, and there's so many things that were coming up for me as you were saying that, because you're essentially saying that, we get told what is going to make us happy, and we get told that it's outside of ourselves, when really all the things that you're describing, connection, meaning, purpose, freedom, those are all intrinsic things that we can find. And it really comes from the inside, and it's not all these material things that we get told in society, and accumulating more stuff. And I think tiny house living in a general sense really lends itself to this idea of the hedonic adaptation that you're talking about, because there is this reassessing of, what's important to me and how do I want to spend my days and live. And I think, again, I'll talk about Marie again, because there were a lot of great things that she mentioned when we spoke. She talked about like the kind of life that you want to live, and then design a tiny house around that and what your needs are and how you want to spend your days. And then she also talked about how don't think just by having a tiny house that's going to solve all your problems, because life is still going to happen. You'll be living in your tiny house, and you'll feel great in many different ways. But life still happens, and you're still going to have those challenges that come about, or you're still going to have these things that are put on your path that maybe some days you're not feeling like your best self. But so it's like finding that happiness internally, and then sort of the tiny house comes after that, and you can kind of create what you want from the inside out. And yeah, I just love that you mentioned that, and I think it's a really great thing to consider. And it's just like anything, we should always ask, like, why do we want to do this? It's not, is it because someone told us that we should do this, or is it because like this is something that's really, part of our path and is a way that we can, live life on our own terms, or create more freedom in many different ways, or be more connected to the earth, be more connected to each other, slow down, simplify life and think about what's most important.
To add to that point, before we were talking together about how, we're both minimalists, right? And so there's another way, it's the same thing, but it's just thinking about a different way, is that, the whole Marie Kondo, does it add joy? And so all of your stuff, if you've got lots of stuff, you can only have so many interactions in a day, and you're dividing amongst all of your things, and some of them great and some of them bad and some of them good. But if you just sort of get rid of all the bad things, you're left with just good. And so like that's minimalism, right? It's sort of optimizing every interaction is positive, or at the most. But that's like another way of the same thing. Think the same thing. When you're designing your house, you pick up the thing. It's like, why am I doing this? What thing am I trying to accomplish? You shouldn't just do it because that's what other people do. You should do it because it adds joy, and that it's filling a niche. Everything you do, you kind of need to make a argument at how is this directly making you happier. And if you can't make that argument, then you should be asking, should you even be doing it? And so that, that there's a lot of them, like with houses, do you need this massive entry rooms? Will this third car actually make you happier? And you have to be quite honest with yourself, because just more for more sake doesn't, necessarily mean you'll be happier.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I don't know. I imagine it, quite fits with your own. But it's not just me saying this. It's like the research is out there. It's just there. Any book on happiness. And I just always find it funny that it's not talked about more, because it's, like a cornerstone of life, happiness. Like it's not everything, but it's part of it. I think the reason it's not talked about more is that there's nothing to sell.
Exactly.
We're just telling people to be content. It's like,
it's
no,
so
you
true.
Don't need that thing.
It's so true. Yeah.
Buy this.
There's no way to create an industry out of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe there is, but then that comes along with that message of happiness is outside of yourself in this, whatever this material thing that is being sold to you.
No, but the selling of itself is trying to tell you to be you're trying to make them feel unhappy.
Yeah.
And that the solution to that unhappiness is your product.
Yeah.
And you almost want to do the opposite.
Yeah.
You almost do the opposite. Like, no, it's not like, so my wife's Buddhist, right? And so it's all just about, life is what happens to you. It's not like life is how you react to what happened to you, not actually what happens to you. It's all this narrative in your head.
Totally.
About your life rather than what happens in your life. And I don't know. I think this is just undervalued.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it adds another a layer and dimension of thinking about like this tiny house journey and what it means for each individual person and how they can find their happiness within whatever they're creating, with their tiny house, with the lifestyle that they're working towards and all of those things. So I'm really glad that you said that. And Everett, do you want to just mention your website one more time? And if there's anywhere else you wanted to point people to as well, or you can just let us know where people can find you again. Yeah.
Yes, it is. So Everhomes. So www.everett. No, that's my name. Sorry.
It's short for your name though, right?
Maybe. No, Everhomes. EVERHOMES.
Beautiful.
.co.nz.
Okay, I'll put a link at tinyhouseconversations.com. And Everett, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been really great to talk to you, get to know a bit more about you and what you're doing. And I love the passion. I love all the technical knowledge that you have. And I love the depth that you brought, towards the end of that conversation, just to round things out, because I think it's a really important thing that, as you say, that doesn't get talked about enough. So yeah, I really appreciate your time and your energy today. So thanks again.
Thank you, Lucy.
My pleasure. And if you're listening to us at home, thank you so much for being here as always. Stay tuned every Thursday for new episodes of Tiny House Conversations, and I'll see you next time. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.